Zach Johnson had been farming his family's land for years, fifth generation, over a century of history in the soil. But by 2018, the crops weren't paying the bills, and nobody outside of rural Minnesota had any idea how close things were getting to the edge. What most people don't know is that the channel you've been watching, the brand that's now worth more than the farm itself, almost never happened. Because Zach didn't believe in it. He thought it was a hobby, something to do between planting seasons. It was his wife Becky who looked at what they had built and saw something completely different. A lifeline. She made a decision that Zach wasn't ready to make, stepped into a role nobody asked her to take, and quietly built the infrastructure that saved everything. This is the story most millennial farmer fans have never heard. To understand why Becky's decision mattered so much, you have to understand where these two people came from. Zach and Becky didn't grow up with money. They didn't grow up with connections. They grew up poor in rural Minnesota. Two kids from neighboring small towns who had no reason to believe their lives would look any different from the generations that came before them. And for Zach, that meant farming. It was never really a choice. It was just what his family did. The Johnson farm isn't some recent venture. Zach's ancestors, Swedish immigrants, settled that land back in 1876. That's not just a fun fact, that's nearly 150 years of the same family working the same soil through droughts, downturns, and everything in between. By the time Zach took over his share of the operation, he was carrying 5 generations of history on his back. The farm produces corn and soybeans in west-central Minnesota, and Zach runs it alongside his father Nate, just the two of them full-time on thousands of acres. He and Becky met in high school, two teenagers from towns close enough that their paths crossed, but far enough apart that it still felt like fate. They got married in 2007 and settled into the farmhouse where Zach grew up. They started a family. Becky was working daycare, bringing in her own income, doing what needed to be done. Life was steady. Not glamorous, but steady. What people on the outside don't see about farming is how brutal the economics can be. Commodity prices swing wildly. Input costs, fuel, fertilizer, seed, keep climbing. One bad season doesn't just hurt your bank account, it can set a family operation back years. Zach knew this pressure better than anyone. He'd watched his father navigate it. He was navigating it himself. The farm was holding on, but the margins were thin, and the industry-wide picture wasn't getting any brighter. This was the reality Zach and Becky were living in when he first picked up a camera in 2016. Not as an entrepreneur, not as someone with a plan, just as a farmer who was frustrated and decided he had something to say. The spring of 2016 was when it started, and the reason Zach picked up a camera had nothing to do with YouTube ambitions or building a brand. He was angry, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, grinding way that builds up when you watch people talk confidently about something they know nothing about. Neighbors, friends, relatives, everyone seemed to have an opinion about farming. GMOs were dangerous, pesticides were reckless, tile drains were destroying the environment, and Zach, sitting on land his family had worked for generations, kept hearing it and couldn't let it go. His first instinct was the same as anyone's: argue back, get into the comments, correct the record, push back on the misinformation wherever it showed up. He tried it. It went nowhere, because that's how the internet works. Nobody changes their mind in a comment section. What he realized eventually was that the problem wasn't bad intentions. Most people asking questions about farming weren't enemies of agriculture. They were just disconnected from it. They genuinely didn't know, and that realization shifted everything. So instead of fighting, he decided to show. He grabbed his cell phone and an iPad Air 2, no professional equipment, no production budget, nothing, and started filming his days on the farm, planting season, equipment breakdowns, the unglamorous, repetitive, physically demanding reality of what it actually takes to grow food at scale. His first video was simple and direct. I started this video because I'm concerned about the disconnect between farmers and consumers, he said into the camera. No script, no agenda beyond honesty. He taught himself everything: editing, pacing, framing, all of it learned by watching YouTube tutorials late at night after full days in the field. The irony of using YouTube to learn how to make YouTube videos wasn't lost on him, but it worked. The early content was raw and unpolished, and that turned out to be exactly the point. Viewers weren't watching a production. They were watching a real farmer go to work, make mistakes, solve problems, and keep moving. For most of 2016 and into 2017, the channel grew slowly. Zach kept posting, kept filming, and had no idea what was about to happen. Fall of 2017 changed everything, and it happened fast. Zach uploaded a video called Gearing Up for Harvest and watched it hit 100,000 views in 3 to 4 days. That had never happened before, not even close. For context, most of his earlier videos were grinding slowly toward modest view counts over weeks. This was something different, and both Zach and Becky knew it, even if they didn't quite know what to do with it yet. But here's where the story gets interesting, because Zach's reaction to that momentum wasn't excitement, it was hesitation. He was already stretched thin running a full-time farming operation with his father. The idea of turning the channel into something serious felt like taking on a second job he hadn't signed up for. "I didn't really take that seriously," he'd later admit. "I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't really have that interest in it." For Zach, the videos were still a way to talk about agriculture. The business side of it didn't register as real. Becky saw it differently. While Zach was focused on the next day's work on the farm, she was paying attention to what was building around the channel, the engagement, the growth, the pattern of people genuinely connecting with what he was putting out. She'd watched enough to understand that this wasn't just a hobby with a good month. This was an audience. And audiences, if you work them right, become something you can build on. She pushed him, directly and persistently. Her argument was straightforward. People were making real money doing exactly what Zach was already doing, and the only thing standing between them and that opportunity was the decision to take it seriously. "For a lot of people, this is a legitimate thing that they can make money at," she told him. Not a speculation, a fact she'd already worked out while he was still dismissing the idea. It took convincing. Zach wasn't an easy sell. But Becky didn't back off, and eventually he came around. What neither of them fully understood in that moment was just how much was riding on that conversation, and how much further Becky was about to take it. Convincing Zach to take the channel seriously was one thing. What Becky did next was something else entirely. She didn't just encourage him from the sidelines and hope for the best. She made a decision that most people in her position wouldn't have made. She walked away from her daycare job and went all in on the Millennial farmer brand full-time. No safety net, no guarantee it was going to work, just a calculated bet on something she believed in more than her husband did at the time. And the moment she did that, everything changed structurally. Because up until that point, the channel was one person filming his days on a farm with a consumer-grade camera. What it needed to become a real business was infrastructure, and Becky built it from scratch. She took over the video editing, teaching herself new techniques almost daily by watching tutorials. The same way Zach had taught himself in the beginning, she handled the accounting, the advertising, the social media presence across every platform, sponsorship inquiries, speaking tour bookings, brand partnership negotiations, all of it ran through Becky. What that meant in practice was a clean division of labor that made the whole operation actually functional. Zach filmed and farmed, he stayed on the land, kept the content coming, kept the channel authentic to what it had always been. Becky ran the business around him. She was the reason a sponsorship deal got closed while Zach was out fixing a piece of equipment at 6 in the morning. She was the reason the books were balanced, the inbox was managed, and the brand kept growing while the farming kept happening simultaneously. Her Instagram bio today tells the story plainly. Video and audio engineer, PR manager, business manager, not a supporting role, not a helper. A full partner running half of a media operation that neither of them originally planned to build. Without that decision, without Becky choosing to bet on the channel the way she did, the brand never becomes what it became. The content might have kept coming, but the machine that turned that content into a sustainable business simply wouldn't have existed. That part was entirely her. By 2018, the timing of Becky's decision had gone from smart to critical. Because that year the farm took real losses. Commodity prices were down, farming conditions had worsened across the region, and the income from the land that 5 generations of Johnsons had worked wasn't covering what it needed to cover. This wasn't a rough patch that could be quietly absorbed and forgotten about. This was the kind of year that breaks family operations, the kind that forces decisions about whether to keep going or start selling things off. But there was another income stream now. And it made the difference. The YouTube money Zach and Becky had been building through 2017 and into 2018 directly offset those farming losses. Not supplemented them, offset them. It was the buffer that kept the operation stable while the agricultural side of their lives was bleeding. For a family that had grown up poor in rural Minnesota and spent years fighting for every inch of financial ground, that buffer wasn't a luxury. It was survival. The channel kept growing through all of it. The tractor stuck in the mud video became the moment that proved the formula worked at scale. A simple, unscripted crisis on the farm, handled calmly, with Zach and his crew working through it without drama. No yelling, no panic, just problem solving on camera. Viewers couldn't get enough of it. That video went on to rack up over 3.7 million views and became the clearest example of why the Millennial Farmer brand connected the way it did. Real people, real problems, real outcomes. By 2019, the numbers had flipped entirely. The brand was generating at least 5 times more income than the actual crops. Think about that for a second. A fifth-generation farming family, on land work since 1876, now earning more from a YouTube channel than from the corn and soybeans that had defined their entire existence. Zach was open about what that meant. The goal became using YouTube income to cover family living expenses and reinvesting everything the farm earned back into the operation itself. What Becky had seen coming in 2017 had arrived, and it had arrived just in time. Once the foundation was solid, Becky didn't slow down. She expanded. What had started as a single YouTube channel filming farm life in rural Minnesota had grown into something that needed to be treated like a proper media company. And that's exactly how she treated it. The Millennial Farmer brand began stretching into every direction a loyal audience could be monetized, and behind every one of those moves was the same woman who had talked Zach into taking it seriously in the first place. The merchandise came first. T-shirts, caps, beer cozies, the kind of branded product line that only works if an audience genuinely feels connected to the people behind it. Theirs did. Zach mentioned it himself, saying the merchandise really took off in a way that surprised even them. For a couple who grew up poor in rural Minnesota, watching strangers across the country wear their brand wasn't something either of them had ever pictured. Then came the speaking tours. Zach had built a reputation as a credible, articulate voice for agriculture, and that opened doors to events, panels, and industry engagements that brought in another layer of income entirely. Becky managed all of it. The bookings, the logistics, the follow-through. None of that happens without someone running point on the business side while the public-facing personality is out in a field somewhere. The podcast followed. Off the Husk launched with Zach, Becky, and their friend Randy Nessman, and was backed by Farmers Business Network, the biggest sponsor the brand had landed to that point. It was another platform, another audience, another revenue stream added to a portfolio that kept getting wider. Becky's fingerprints were on the production side of that too, with her role as video and audio engineer extending well beyond the YouTube channel. Sponsorship deals rounded out the picture. Brand partnerships with companies like WD-40 and others in the agricultural space gave the channel a steady commercial backbone that ad revenue alone couldn't provide. Becky negotiated and managed those relationships while Zach delivered the content that made them worth paying for. The brand Zach had dismissed as a hobby in 2017 had become a full-scale operation, and it ran because Becky built the infrastructure to make it run. At some point, the money stopped being the most interesting part of the story, because as the brand grew and the income stabilized, Zach and Becky made a choice that said a lot about who they actually were underneath all of it. They started giving it away, not in a passive, write a check kind of way, in a deliberate, organized, get your hands dirty kind of way that turned the Millennial Farmer platform into something with a purpose beyond views and revenue. It started with a problem Zach knew personally. Minnesota and North Dakota lead the nation in grain bin deaths. For people outside of agriculture, grain bin accidents barely register as a topic. For farming communities, they're a quiet devastation that shows up in the news with grim regularity. Farmers, often young ones, suffocating or being crushed inside the storage bins that are a standard feature of almost every operation in the region. Zach had the platform to do something about the awareness gap, and he decided to use it. He and Becky launched a nonprofit called Harvest Outreach, built specifically to raise money for volunteer fire departments and first responder crews to purchase grain bin rescue equipment and fund the training to use it properly. They announced it to their audience and asked for support. The response was immediate. Viewers who had spent years watching Zach work that land understood exactly why this mattered, and they showed up. The campaign raised over $100,000 for more than 80 fire departments across the region. The impact became concrete in a way that's hard to argue with. Equipment purchased through those donations in Illinois, was later confirmed to have directly saved a life. A real person who went home because a fire department had the right gear at the right moment, funded in part by an audience watching a farmer film his days in Minnesota. In 2022, Zach took it further and volunteered directly with Farm Rescue, an organization that steps in to help farming families complete critical field work when illness, injury, or disaster makes it impossible to manage alone. He showed up, worked a case in Raymond, Minnesota, and used his platform to raise awareness for the organization at the same time. The channel had become something neither of them planned, something that mattered beyond the algorithm. In February 2022, the Millennial Farmer channel crossed 1 million subscribers. It's a milestone most creators spend years chasing and never reach. And for Zach, a man who had filmed his first video on a cell phone with zero expectation of anyone watching, it represented something almost impossible to fully process. A fifth-generation farmer from a small town in west-central Minnesota, now one of the most watched agricultural voices on the entire platform. His most watched video sitting at over 3.7 million views. A brand worth more annually than the crops his family had been growing for nearly 150 years. But the version of Zach Johnson that exists at 1 million subscribers only gets there because of the version of Becky Johnson that existed in 2017, sitting with the numbers, watching the growth, and refusing to let her husband talk himself out of something she could already see clearly. That's the part the subscriber count doesn't show, the part that doesn't appear in any of the highlight videos. Becky has always been clear-eyed about how fragile it all is. YouTube could change some algorithm and that could just be it, she said in one interview. No drama, no anxiety, just the honest acknowledgement of someone who built something real and understands the conditions it depends on. That kind of thinking is exactly what has kept the brand stable. While Zach wrestles openly with the identity tension of spending as much time in the social media world as he does on the land he loves, Becky stays focused on what keeps the operation running. Zach said it himself, in as direct a way as he's ever said anything. It was his wife who pushed him, who told him this was legitimate, who made him see what he couldn't see on his own. Most people hear that and move on, but sit with it for a second. Without that push, there's no brand. Without the brand, there's no buffer in 2018. Without the buffer, a century and a half of family farming history gets a lot harder to hold on to. The Millennial Farmer is Zach's name, Zach's face, and Zach's land. But the decision that saved it? That was Becky's.